Hey everyone, welcome to a special video about values-based hiring processes. This one is specifically about the search committee. Um, Katrina and I have received a lot of questions about how we think about the search committee process being different than maybe a more traditional process. And so we wanted to take a moment to record a video for people who would be considering whether or not they want to be a part of the search committee to get some more familiarity with like what it's like to do that as a part of a process that we help lead, that's really designed and co-created around values. So that's the purpose of our time together. And yeah, I will just say that over and over again. Hey, Katrina, excited to dive into this topic with you today.
Yeah, me too, Tim. I love these initial questions that we've been getting throughout the conversations that I do around getting to know the organization and the people in it, and kind of how we go about the search is always a question that I get asked. And so this is sort of the first step in really getting organized with a group of people to think into this reimagined structure.
We'd like to start with this quote by Adrienne Maree Brown in a lot of the work that we do. I personally find it really centering to why we do this work. This quote is from Adrienne's brilliant book, Emergent Strategies. And the word in brackets is here is the workplace, but Adrienne wrote art. Art is not neutral. And a number of years ago, as I was reading this with my colleagues, thought, wow, this is a really great frame for the work, the human-centered org design work, in particular as it is trying to co-create anti-racist, equitable, inclusive, just workplaces. Really felt like this was a great grounding quote. And so I want to offer this as we get started around the workplace is not neutral. It either upholds or disrupts the status quo, advancing or regressing justice. We are living now inside the imagination of people who thought economic disparity and environmental destruction were acceptable costs for their power. It is our right and responsibility to write ourselves into the future. All organizing is science fiction. If you are shaping the future, you are a futurist. And visionary fiction is a way to practice the future in our minds alone and together. Adrienne Maree Brown. I always find this helpful to start before we get into whatever work we're doing, to think about like how do we shift power dynamics? How do we reframe? How do we pause at those moments that just feel like that's the way you should do it? And why are we doing that? And how can more people be involved and create something that doesn't exist but that fits values and that ultimately creates workplaces where everyone can thrive? And this next slide is really sort of centering anti-racism around, anti-racism is not just a policy. It's a set of principles that we measure every aspect of our organization against. If we think about language, policies, practices, programs, initiatives, offerings, whatever it might be, how do we do that in an anti-racist way? And this might not necessarily be anti-racism for you. Your organization might articulate this as equity or justice or anti-oppression or inclusion. But like, how do you center that and think about everything that you do as part of a search process with that? So how do you do search committee selection or search committee participation in an anti-racist way? And so I really feel like these past two slides help to frame and center like what it is that we're trying to do to really get away from what is a pretty dusty process, right? Right, Katrina. I mean, we have to, like our colleague said this a couple of years back about like hiring is pretty dusty, where it's like it's essentially people are hiring the way they did in 1982, except they're using the internet. And so to really like, how do you dust off the process? What does that mean? So I'm curious, those three, what's resonating for you?
Yeah, and for me, this is loud and clear when I think back to my own sort of certification as a recruiter. When I look back at that text and what we went through in that certification program, I just can't help but think, wow, like the world has changed so much since we've been taught how to do a customary traditional sort of search process. And so there are all of these places where we use the same language because we know what those like what that means. We know outreach means you go out and you talk to people about, the job, or you try to get people interested in it. But then it's about how we do that, and how do you do that, 2 steps before you get started, to really say, what is dusty about this part? What is particularly dusty? Like, what is that on the top shelf that you keep noticing and you keep kind of walking by? How do we stop and give that area a little attention and hold that, right? And then go back and say, is this getting dustier? Are we getting back to, is it growing again? Like, how do we actually pay attention to where dust settles? Like, this little image right here always gets me, right? Like, you're doing a good job, you're undusting it, but that just lands right back down. And so really thinking about the commitment that it takes to sort of look at where the dust is and where it settles, and to continue to sort of 2 steps before you do it, to really think about how that happens.
Yeah, that idea, like dust is going to go someplace, and so how can you, not prevent that? Sort of capture the dust and like move it.
Yeah. There's a great metaphor in there if we took it a little further.
That's true. Yeah, probably a podcast, but
Yeah.
not the purposes of this video. As we thought about like reimagining the search process, dusting it off, this is typically what a search process is like. Like the multiple stages of the search process, where you have a profile, you sort of go out and get candidates, you have recruitment plan, sourcing, advertising, advertising is usually like a job posting. Then you shortlist based off of the candidates that are coming in. You screen them using who knows what kind of criteria. It might not be consistent based off of like the people who are reviewing it. Then you interview, which usually looks like, what are some cool questions that I learned from Google, from reading this article about how Google hires. And then you do the reference checks that are like these quick things, and then you make an offer, and then people accept, reject, and then you move on. And at each one of these stages, as you were talking about, like there's sort of the way to do it, the way like, oh yeah, I read this in a book. This is how you do sourcing, or how you post a job, or like what it's supposed to look like. And when I read traditional, I think white supremacy culture. Mm-hmm. Like how much white supremacy culture is embedded in each one of these things, embedded in how you do it, how you think about it, and how that hinders the ability to share power and decision making, how it hinders candidate care, how you think about the human beings that are part of this process, who are probably fans of your organization, and will they still be fans of your organization at the end of this process, even if they don't get the job offer. You sketched out sort of going from that sort of traditional search process to the things that we center and we invite people to center in the process. And can you take us through those 4 different anchors?
Yeah, totally. In my mind, the previous slide is like the work, but this is the work. I think that we're, really asking the selection, the search committee to participate in with us. And so, jumping back to Adrienne Maree Brown's quote around shaping the future, this is a group of futurists in this case. And so what do we know about reading science fiction? Sometimes it feels far out. Sometimes it feels uncomfortable or unbelievable. Sometimes it feels like this would never, work in real life, or there's holes in the plots, or whatever it is. But the idea is that it's because we have never really thought about it like that before, right? And so the first thing we do is we breathe and we say, there are places to pause here. That long list that Tim shared, that, Western management, white supremacy culture entrenched list of how to go about a search. There are little places to pause in all of that, to dust it off. And so what we're asking is take the time to breathe together, to say, let's not just assume that we jump from here to here. Let's actually be humble and stretch around how this could feel different at every turn. And so that means, from a search committee perspective, that sometimes, it might be Tim and I reminding the committee to breathe together. Sometimes it might be you who hears something and can encourage the group just to take a breath and let's just recenter ourselves, because we're really, trying our hardest to be committed to breathing, pausing, reimagining throughout this process. I think the second part here around distributing power is so big. There are tons of assumptions that we make around questions that are included, people that get included, people who get excluded, candidates or otherwise from different parts of the organization. And when we organize into kind of interviews or screening or any of those kinds of things, how are we intentionally trying to account for power dynamics in those conversations or in that decision making? This comes up a lot in interviewing, for example, when we build into the script that there's going to be time for candidates' questions at the end, and then we lose the plot in the interview, or we get distracted, or we follow a different lead, and all of a sudden there's 2 minutes to close the interview, hear candidate questions, and do the things. Well, from a power perspective, right, that candidate hasn't had a chance to ask any questions. We haven't had a chance to have that candidate's curiosity come back to us. We have dominated that conversation with our own agenda. And so that's some examples of how that comes out. And so just being aware, and I think there's as a search committee member, there's also this awareness of how you're participating or how others are participating. If you're somebody that tends to, talk a lot, lead conversations, organize meetings or agendas, facilitate things, you may have a tendency to fill in silence gaps or, power through the conversation. If you're somebody who is used to sitting back and listening, or kind of feeling like it's a conversation for others to have, if you're here on the committee, we'd love you to step into kind of what's the inverse of that role. How do I take less space, or how do I take more space, depending on how you typically contribute? What does that look like? And how can we encourage each other to live into those intentions? This third piece around reframing. So there are parts of search that can get pretty tenuous, right? We have a tendency to look at candidates versus other candidates for the role. And so the reframe that we continuously do, for example, is how do we look at the candidates in relationship to the role, in relationship to the opportunity that's here? And so in just shifting that way of thinking about it, we're actually controlling conditions in a little bit of a different way, right? We're inviting a different possibility. We're inviting a different way of looking at things. And so there are times in this process where we do tend to steamroll through because of sense of urgency or because of personal preference or bias or whatever it is. And what we're asking is really to pause, notice when that happens, and offer reframes, or reframe for yourself, or ask for a reframe, because we're going to be in the thick of it together. And so really thinking about, like, how do we notice when we're stuck as a group, or when we're barreling down, one specific part of the road, and take that stuff back and switch our perspectives a little bit. And then fourth, this is about co-creation. So we, as we've talked about, futurists on this journey. And so we're inventing something that doesn't exist yet. Tim and I have participated in these processes before, but no two are alike because of context and search committee members and the specifics of the role, all of the different factors that come into it. And so really on the search committee, we're asking each of you to step in and to help us to co-create what this feels like for the search committee, how the process rolls, how we can imagine it might feel like for candidates, and be an inviting space for people to be curious about this role, this organization, in this moment for themselves. Tim, is there anything you'd add?
The two things that really resonate for me in this slide, as I think about having worked with search committees, are power and discomfort. When a search committee is really gelling and trying to reimagine what search looks like, they're questioning power dynamics in all those ways that you described. And they'll also say, like, that was kind of uncomfortable for me to be like, I didn't like, it was uncertain what was going to happen because it wasn't the usual thing that I expect. It was like, I've done hundreds of searches, but I've never done one in this way. And so, like, you don't quite know what's going to happen. And as you often talk about, like, we're building the plane while we're flying it. We're using developmental evaluation to form what's next and reflect on it and build. And so, like, for those who are uncomfortable with those like shifts in power and like really being with discomfort and uncertainty, this is probably not the search process for you to be involved in, because it's going to ask you to do that. And that's kind of the magic where it happens, because it's a group of people who come together to be like, okay, traditional search isn't great. There's missing a lot. And how do we do that? And how do we do in the messiness and also care for those that are candidates and ourselves? And so that's what I take when looking at this slide, when sort of reflecting on this slide, are those two dynamics, the power and discomfort that come into play during this process. And again, that's kind of like at the intersection of like magical, where you're like, oh, those things are at play. And when you really lean into that, that's where some really cool things get to happen.